Hello and welcome to India's World. There are two issues that have stood out in India-China relations in recent weeks. One is the incursion of Chinese troops into a territory in Ladakh which is normally controlled by India. And the second is Indian fears about Chinese dams on the Brahmaputra which might affect Indian interests downstream. India shares a 4,000-kilometer long line of actual control with China. This border has not been delineated and it is not marked on maps. There have been several high-level dialogues on the border, but they have come to nothing as yet. There are areas where the line of actual control itself is disputed. There are different perceptions of who controls what. In these pockets, there are regular incursions. These incursions are by way of marking territory, by way of laying claims to that area. But soldiers come and they go away. They never pitch tents. This time, they have pitched tents. To discuss this latest border issue, as well as resource sharing, that is river water sharing in Brahmaputra, I have with me a very distinguished panel of experts. I have with me Ambassador Nalin Surie. He's had a formidable career in the Foreign Service. He was our ambassador to China, High Commissioner to UK, and people say nobody knows the China-India border better than him. Dr. Jabin Jacob, he's Assistant Director of Institute of Chinese Studies. He was in China recently. He speaks the language and is an expert on Sino-Indian relations. My old friend, Ambassador TCA Rangachari, one of our foremost experts on China, and currently a professor at Jamia Millia Islamia, Director of the Academy of International Studies. Welcome all of you to the show, to this conversation. Mr. Surie, let me begin with you. Why is it that China is reluctant to pursue the process which was laid down in 2002-2003 to settle these pockets where perceptions of the LAC differ? Why don't we share each other's perceptions and claim various claims and work out a compromise?
The problem is the process of LAC demarcation and identification of areas of difference in the LAC, perceptions of the LAC of the two sides, was never completed. It started with the middle sector where maps were exchanged and the areas of difference were identified.
Middle sector is which sector?
Middle sector is the sector which really covers Uttarakhand and Himachal Pradesh. As you know, in Sikkim there is no problem. It's a settled, by and large settled border. All the actual demarcation has to take place. The next stage was to exchange LAC perceptions on the western sector. That process had started. There were some difficulties. To be very honest, the Chinese had some reluctance to accept our maps, which was...
This is the Ladakh sector?
Yeah, this is the Ladakh sector. Before we could complete the western sector process, the process of actual boundary discussions as part of the special representative process began after Mr. Vajpayee's visit in late 2003. And as a result, I believe and I feel that the LAC clarification process, which is actually the heart of the 93, 96 and 2005 agreements, sort of went by the wayside. So the problem that is arising today is precisely because of that in this sector, in western and eastern sectors, that we do not have a common perception either of the LAC or of the differences in the LAC as per each other's perceptions.
Ranga, why has there been so little progress? Do you share this analysis of Ambassador Surie?
Well, you see, if you go one step back, the whole idea was that because of the fact that the exercise of coming to an agreement insofar as the boundary itself was concerned and coming to a mutual agreement was proving to be so difficult, the idea was that till such time as we resolve the boundary issue, we should at least have clarity in regard to what we perceive to be our respective lines of control, so that there is no incident and there is no inadvertent move by one or the other side, as a result of which there might be some problems, some difficulties in the relationship. Now, this exercise, which started sometime in the mid-90s and went on for about 10 years, and as Ambassador Surie has just mentioned, we were able to cover the middle sector, but we were not able to get very far with the western sector. And then, of course, the eastern sector didn't come up at all. Leaves us in a situation where today there is an incentive for both sides to match their ground positions with the map positions.
Perceived map positions. Because there is no real map position.
Well, there is no real map position in the sense that there is no agreed map position. Yeah. But we do have real map positions on each side. So therefore, if one or the other side takes it upon itself that we are going to establish a ground presence which matches our map position, then you would be in a situation where the other side could have some grievance, some cause for complaint, if that ground position and that map position is not in accord with the other side's perception. And I think that's what you're seeing now is what is happening on the ground.
But isn't this limited to about 17 or 18 pockets only?
Well, numerically, I don't think that is in itself very important. I think it's a broader question of principle, of how you go about establishing a relationship in a situation where things are not very clear. If you're going to have confidence, and it's very important that there should be confidence, because both sides at the highest levels have talked about a trust deficit. If you're going to bridge that trust deficit, then it's very important that neither side should take any action which is going to in any way bring into question the trust that the other side is going to develop or have in you. And I think in many ways the present incident as it has come about creates a problem precisely for that reason, that something was being done by the Indian side over a period of time. The Chinese side has done something which is a little different from what they have done in the past. And whenever there is some unpredictability on the ground situation, whenever there are things which happen which have not happened in the past, it naturally makes the other side feel uncomfortable, uncertain. And in that situation, it's very necessary that it should be handled with care so that it doesn't get out of hand.
Okay. Dr. Jacob, tell me that why China is reluctant or is slow in settling the border with India when it has settled its border with its Central Asian neighbors. It's settled its huge border problem with Russia, it's settled its border problem with Myanmar, and even settled with Pakistan, even though illegally.
See, I mean, the most important thing to note is that India is not on the same level as the other countries here are concerned. I'm not saying India is at a lower level, but this is a border dispute or a boundary dispute of a qualitatively different order or different magnitude. The Chinese clearly settled their boundary disputes with smaller countries and with the Russia that was, basically in decline. India is not, a country in decline. India is a rising power. So the Chinese have a different tack that they've adopted with the Indians.
Which is go slow.
Which is go slow. I mean, that is what they say, but it's also the fact of the matter is that there is no agreement on any principles here. I mean, there is a treaty, a 2005 treaty, but beyond that treaty, there is little agreement in, for example, as the ambassadors have said, on clarification of the LAC and so on. The point to note is that as long as there is no congruence between the LACs of the two sides, we must expect such incidents to continue. And this should not be treated as anything out of the ordinary. This is pretty much normal. If you're talking about 500 or 600 incidents in the course of 3 years, you pretty much have an incident practically every single day.
No need to get jingoistic and no need
Absolutely
to go for high rhetoric.
Why not?
We need to take a break at this juncture. We'll be back with this discussion after the break. Don't go away. Welcome back. We are discussing India-China border issues. Ambassador Surie, you wanted to say something on the border issue.
Yeah, I think I just take off from what Dr. Jacob just said. I would not be as dismissive of the April 2005 political parameters for settling the border issue. I think it's a very substantive document. The reason why it's substantive is because the Chinese have actually moved considerably from their historical position on the negotiations on this issue. And I think that is why it's going to be more difficult to do the second and third phases of the border settlement, because they have to also explain to their own internal system why they have agreed to these new parameters.
Okay.
There's a very substantial difference between what their position was and what they finally accepted.
So you see progress happening?
I think the 2005 parameters are a very substantial progress. I mean, we could have held out for perhaps an even better agreement, but that's a political judgment the leadership of the time has to take. And a judgment was taken. And to my view, it's a very good set of political parameters and guiding principles to settle the border on. It will help take both sides out of their entrenched situations and apply certain principles which should enable a proper border settlement to take place. Yes. But this will take time, because I think both sides have to explain to their constituents on what this entails.
Have we explained, Ranga, to the people of this country what is really happening? Or you think somewhere the establishment has failed because there's so much of fanning of jingoism and, sort of show the Chinese what we can do, we are not cowards and so on and so forth?
Well, if you are asking me from the point of view of whether we should do introspection, then I think we should not forget because there is a resolution passed by the Indian Parliament on this question of how far we can go in regard to the boundary settlement. Now, if you look back over the last 15 years or so, virtually every single political party in the Indian political spectrum has been in power in Delhi. None of them have ever said that they disagree with that resolution or that they are going to do anything to bring about a change in that resolution. What that resolution said was that an agreement can be reached, and I'm paraphrasing and making it said it in very broad terms, that an agreement, only that can be agreed upon where the Chinese concede everything that is our claim. Now, if that is the formal approach and we want to stand by that, then this question of introspection comes in as to how realistic that position can be under the given circumstances. And if our view is that no, we cannot for whatever reason, good, bad, indifferent is a matter of judgment and debate. If we are not in a position to bring about a change, then should we or are we in a position to be in a hurry to settle the border issue?
Dr. Jacob, if you just get your information from the media and you don't have sort of formidable analysts like yourselves telling people what's happening, you would think that the media wants to sort of fight the 1962 war all over again and win. So do you think the media's not played a good role in this?
I mean, I think the media needs to be educated a bit more about what is the progress that has been made so far. And I agree with Ambassador Surie that the 2005 agreement was actually a very big step forward. We actually got the Chinese to agree on things that they hadn't agreed to before. But the point, is that, the process doesn't stop there. The government has a better job to do in terms of communicating to the general public, including the media, as to what each of these steps in the China-India relationship have been about and how to interpret them. That's one thing. But also the government, the real problem is, after 2005, how have we progressed in terms of building up other capabilities, our wherewithal to counter such incursions? I mean, the Chinese have picked a spot and they've generally, we say that the Chinese have been conducting these incursions. We have also been conducting these incursions at the same time. But the fact of the matter is, our capacity in these border areas is still pretty weak, which is why we have a problem preempting or reacting to these in any other way except continue talks.
Well, I'm still in favor of diplomatic way of preventing these things,
I'm not saying we should not
mountain divisions, and saying that we'll show you.
My point is we should continue to strengthen our defenses. But that is, just like we have had a negotiation or we have had a treaty is no excuse for us to stop continuing defenses. The other is also true.
What you're saying, and I think it's a perfectly legitimate point of view, is that this is a parallel process. You're talking to the Chinese on one side, that's fine, but at least at the same time, make sure that your capabilities are such.
Okay. Let me ask you a slightly different question, Ambassador Surie. Take the issue of Brahmaputra, of sharing the waters of the Brahmaputra. Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, when he met the Chinese president in Durban, discussed Indian apprehensions about proposed dams on the Brahmaputra in the Tibet autonomous region and how they might affect Indian interests. He proposed a joint mechanism for monitoring what's happening. But China hasn't been very forthcoming in terms of setting up this mechanism.
I think this requires a slightly longer answer, so please bear with me. We had an agreement on sharing of water, flood water data with the Chinese in the early 50s. This expired with the 62 war. It was over. We revived that when Churumchi came to India, but that was limited to the Satluj. Our next step was to revive this for the whole Brahmaputra system. Which took a little longer, but we now have a system in place where we exchange floodwater data, or we receive floodwater data from the Chinese side on the Brahmaputra also. The problem is the Chinese have never gone beyond that. The understanding in the in the working group on rivers, joint rivers, was that we would have a mechanism where we'd have in-depth discussions on many other issues. That aspect of the relationship has not progressed, and perhaps with good reason on the Chinese side, because they have very old established plans for these rivers which run in Tibet. And these plans are not new, they are as old as the 1950s. It's just that today China has the wherewithal, the capacity and the technological skills to start implementing some of these projects. Now, so far they run the river projects fine, doesn't affect flows downstream. But if you actually start projects which divert the waters, and let's face it, there is a huge Chinese project for diverting southern waters to the northern rivers.
Yeah.
One such scheme is already in place. The plan to divert Brahmaputra water into mainland China is not a new one. On paper, it had stands approved many years ago. So it's a genuine concern on the Indian side, and it's been raised with them many times, not once. But the problem is we are not the only lower riparian facing a problem with the Chinese on this issue.
Dr. Jacob, even if water is diverted up north from the Brahmaputra, if it is done during the monsoon months, it may actually prevent flooding downstream in India and Bangladesh. Similarly, even if they do run-of-the-river projects, or even if, whatever waterworks they build, if the flow to India of 79 billion cubic meters continues, how are we bothered?
No, I think, see, this water diversion, the fact of the matter is about 70% of the volume of the Brahmaputra comes from our side, our side of the border. So, if as long as they are run-of-the-river projects, there really isn't a problem except maybe in the lean season. Yeah. But it's a question, the problem is really one of management of our water resources on our side, and that is why we have about 160 odd big and small dams being built in Arunachal Pradesh right now. Yeah. Now, the question of water diversion on the Chinese side, there are a bunch of lessons that we need to pay attention.
I'll come back to that in a minute. We need to take a break at this juncture. We'll continue with this discussion and go back to Dr. Jacob on Chinese attempts of diverting Brahmaputra water up north. We'll take a break. Don't go away. Keep watching Rajya Sabha TV. Welcome back. We are discussing China-India border issues. Dr. Jacob, I interrupted you before we went on the break about Chinese attempts to divert water from the Brahmaputra up north.
See, we have to understand what the Chinese experiences with large-scale infrastructure projects in China, in their own country, have been. And they've had, the Chinese are one of the biggest dam builders in the world, and they've built a whole number of dams in their own country, but these have come with very heavy environmental costs. So this whole business of water diversion, I mean, I agree it's a very old plan. They've been talking of water diversion projects since the Republican times. Sun Yat-sen's one of his big dreams was these large scale diversions. But
my question to you was, suppose they divert water during the monsoon season and store it up north, how does it affect our interests?
No, I mean, look, firstly, what do you mean, how will they divert the water? I mean, this is not a small technical task, this is a huge process. So, you have to understand, it's one thing to have plans, it's another thing to implement them. And there is a lot of rethink going on in China about such large scale projects. This is going to cost a lot of money, and this is going to cost a lot, I mean, it's going to have a large cost in terms of environmental factors. Okay. So, it's not so easy to actually implement something like this.
Ranga, is our fear really that, you know, if the big dam, the 40,000 megawatt dam on the Great Bend on the Brahmaputra comes up, then water could be used as a coercive leverage of foreign policy?
But you see, let's look at it from another point of view, which is that in this whole situation of upper and lower riparians, there are many examples around the world where there is a joint management of river waters. There is no reason why we should not be able to study those, and why not just India, but Pakistan, Bangladesh, which are also lower riparians to China. And then there are others in Southeast Asia, for example, even Myanmar, for example. Why all of these countries cannot, together with the Chinese, sit down and see how there can be some mechanism patterned on whatever else is happening by way of international practices, good international practices. So far the Chinese have been unresponsive. There is a Mekong, for example, you see they have an organization. 2 years ago the Chinese sent a delegation there, but the Chinese delegate did not participate except to just listen to what was being said. So that is one. Secondly, when you look at the longer term issue, not simply in terms of nation states, but as peoples who are living around a water system, and you're thinking in terms of sustainable development and our ability to survive, then this is something again which should come on the agenda of trust building, that we are able to look at interests not just of ourselves but also of others around us. That goes for India too, because we also have a certain pattern of looking at this issue vis-a-vis our lower riparians. In the case of China, they have said we will take the interests of the lower riparians, but then that's a unilaterally determined interest.
Yeah, I wanted to take this unilateralism to Ambassador Surie. This Chinese unilateralism, where does it come from? if US has not been able to dominate the world, the Chinese are not going to be able to dominate this region, irrespective of, how big an economic power they become. So is it not in their interest to give up this unilateralism, be less opaque and, follow a more dialogic approach?
No, you're absolutely right. Logic would suggest that. And hopefully time will move them in that direction. But right now they are so focused on building their so-called comprehensive national strength to the detriment or to the exclusion of everything else, that they're not looking at it necessarily from that perspective. But I think as world opinion, public opinion builds up, and internal opinion builds up, as Dr. Jacob said, about the impact of these huge projects. And as Ranga said, the issue of collaborating with lower riparians is the way to go ahead on all these projects. And let me also take you back to your earlier point that if they divert the rivers, it will help us in the monsoons. There is no guarantee about that. See, because if they divert the waters, we do not know what the ultimate flows in the Brahmaputra in India will be. To say that 70% of the flows are in India is only a speculative figure, because we do not have accurate data to determine that. Okay. If you're talking about the main rivers in Arunachal, yes, but not the Brahmaputra. Okay. We must distinguish between the Subansiri and the Brahmaputra.
No, under these circumstances, in this context, how do you see Chinese overtures to India? On the one hand, you have the Brahmaputra issue, then you have these border incursions. You also have China making very positive overtures to India. After all, the Chinese Prime Minister is scheduled to visit India soon, and you saw the way President Xi Jinping talked about the 5 principles which should be the basis of our relationship, etc. So is China serious about improving ties with India, or is this because they don't want a new India to play the sort of American linchpin in this region, or they're afraid of the tripartite entente that's taking place between US, India and Japan, and they want to counter that, divide your enemies?
See, I don't see a contradiction in the two approaches the Chinese are following. This is exactly what big powers, and especially two big powers that are neighbors, will do. You have a soft approach and you try a hard approach as well. This is exactly what India is doing. I mean, you mentioned the US, Japan, India trilateral. I mean, what is India doing except the same thing, that we want good relations with China, but that does not mean that we shall, limit our relationships with other countries that may or may not be perceived as China's rivals. I see the important thing to note is the Chinese are interested in talking as well. That is why they approached us on this dialogue on Afghanistan. And what have we to gain by mistrusting or not dealing with them, except the fact that the Chinese and Pakistanis will end up dealing on Afghanistan. So we want to be part of the process. However, at a disadvantage we might be, but it's important to be part of the process.
Raga, but I would add a note of caution here. Go by what the Chinese themselves are saying. No, Xi Jinping made a statement to the Politburo at the end of January, in which he made it very, very clear that there will be no compromise on what China considers to be its core interests. The problem is the Chinese haven't spelled out what their core interests are. Till 3 years ago, isn't it? Till recently, till about 3 years ago, it used to be Tibet and Taiwan. Then South China Sea started getting mentioned as a core interest. Now we don't know at what point others, maybe for that matter, even India-China border issue would become a core interest. So these are some things that we must, at one side, yes, you carry on with the process of dialogue, goodwill, and so on. That is something which is very essential. At the same time, we have to be vigilant of what the Chinese are saying to their own people, what they are doing on the ground, and we should not find ourselves in a situation where things work to our disadvantage, because we have only believed in goodwill that China may have. For their own reasons today, they need peace and stability. For their own reasons today, they need to make sure that the neighborhood is not one in which, if, for example, the Americans want to come in and play a role which you were mentioning about, a pivot and so on, somehow that is kept at bay. So they have their own reasons for doing so. Equally, we must also perceive our own interests.
Ambassador Surie, last word to you. How should we deal with China, considering that in India the perception is the Chinese have an inherent advantage over us? So should we explore this relationship fully without any reservations, or should we have some reservations?
Yeah, let me just briefly go back to what Ambassador Rangachari said. I think China's core interests have by now been reasonably well defined, but they are so broadly defined that you can cover anything under their rubric. By and large, they cover territorial integrity, sovereignty, domestic stability, and of late, development interests. Now, development interests can cover everything. So, these are their core interests. So, you can now build on that to see how it is. Now, question of our dealing with them, I've always maintained that with the Chinese, you must first verify and then trust, not the other way around.
Okay.
So, you keep your powder dry, you verify and then you trust. Now, but at the same time you must remember the Chinese will take you as seriously only as you take yourself.
Okay.
If you are constantly running yourself down.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. We've run out of time. Thank you very much, all of you, for sharing your views on China, the border issue and river water sharing with our viewers. I hope we'll have you again in the studios soon. That's all we have time for today. We'll be back again next week with another issue. Till then, goodbye.